Hi, I'm your host, Dr. Phil Hoffman. Welcome to Pause. Coming up in this episode, we're going to be talking about dogs, fiddles, and raiders, and more. That's coming up right now on Pause. Welcome back to Pause. I'm your host, Dr. Phil Hoffman, and joining us this evening is the curator from the Johnson County Historical Society, Lisa Irle, a good friend of the program here. Welcome back, Lisa.
Thank you very much.
It's good to see you again. So let's talk a little bit about, when we talk about a historical society in any place across the country, talk a little bit about what the mission is typically for a historical society. What are you about? What are you trying to accomplish?
Well, our mission is to collect, preserve, and interpret the history of our region in like paper ephemera and artifacts and just all the different kinds of
stuff.
I'm sorry.
There's stuff, right? There's
Stuff
piles and piles of stuff.
There's stuff, and each item reveals a certain part of our history, and it reveals the personality of people and what was important to people at that time, and also the kinds of employment that people had, and what built our community. And so we preserve that, collect it, and then the interpretation segment is where people come to visit, and we get to teach people, both people who live in the community and people from far away, about our stories.
And it's funny too, because you think, as a person who studies history, I know you know this to be true, folks oftentimes are unaware of the history of their own area, and maybe their families have even been here for generations, but sometimes they don't even know the basics about their neighborhood, their city, the county where they live. And then oftentimes, of course, you have folks who are coming in, like I did not that long ago, and you very graciously sat down right here on the show and gave me the entire history of Johnson County since the dawn of time in one half-an-hour program, and I appreciate that. But it's one of those things where no matter how much you do, there's always more to be done, and there are always new people coming in to learn about the history of this area.
Right, and history being made every day, so there's no end to the recording and the collecting of the items that represent our community. So it's an ongoing mission, and in particular at the Johnson County Historical Society, we have 5 buildings now that we are trying to take care of and maintain. There's our crown jewel, the old courthouse, and the stories that go with it. That's been there since 1834. And then we have a one-room school, a store that needs a lot of care and attention that we're going to have to, people are going to have to come together in the community in order to save that store. People asked us to for many years, and then it was donated to us, but people don't realize the expense to rebuilding something like that. And our past president, Mike Shaw, has been working very hard with just the smallest amount of money that we can have to rebuild parts of that store that were really in trouble. And so almost a quarter of the north wall of the store has been rebuilt clear from the ground up, from the foundation. And so, we make baby steps like that, but with 5 buildings, it's hard to keep the funding coming.
And even like at your home, entropy rules, right? If you walk away from a building and you leave it alone for a while, even if you're totally not doing anything to it, eventually it's just going to sort of collapse in on itself for a variety of reasons. So the reality is there's a lot of funding ongoing funding that has to be in place. When you talk about 5 buildings, that's a pretty hefty price tag, I'm sure, every month, right?
And we're very frugal. We have installed solar panels, also thanks to Mike Shaw, CMO Solar. And so we have cut our costs quite a bit. We have volunteer groundskeepers now who take care of the property and mow and do things. So we've cut back on expenses and cut back on expenses. But it is a very important resource, and especially our museum that also houses the library and the collections. We're the archive of the county records, so there are circuit court records, probate records, deed records, all being protected in our main building. And so there's just, and like you said, a lot of people who live here do not know what kind of resources we have. And we would encourage people to come and visit the Historical Society. And one thing about our collection, we were founded in 1920. So our collection has been cobbled together by women, especially at first women, and then later we had male curators and librarians, and now a man, Herb Best, works in the library all the time. Anyway, they have cobbled this together, so many people who don't think that their families are recorded in our files might be surprised at what's been clipped out over the years. So they might do well to come in and check out the file for their family name, just to see what they might learn.
And I know that recently we were talking about, you had some folks with a genealogy society that you're working with, so there's assistance on that side as well.
Right, and we have always done genealogy, but we have new roommates. The West Central Missouri Genealogical Society has moved into our lower level. So there we have local records processing for the state archives and the Genealogical Society that's open on Saturdays. So yes, we have a lot of people working. In fact, we had a volunteer dinner, and if everyone that's constantly helping us had been there, I think there might have been 100 people. But they're not always there at one time.
Right.
And we need to regularly staff the library, so we're looking for volunteers all the time. We've had a couple of people that had to stop in the last year, and so we're looking for volunteers that just like to meet people. It's fun. The people that come to the museum are from all over the country and all over the world, really, and so we just try to put the best face on our history that we can for the visitors.
So when you think about back in school days and you think about history, a lot of times, as students, history seems like a dull, boring thing. You're just learning names and dates. But I think one of the things for me that's always been fascinating about history is once you get away from that sort of a presentation, you start hearing the stories and what happened and why things are the way they are, then it becomes a lot more interesting and a lot more fascinating, don't you think?
That's right, and people just have to open their minds, because I do really believe that many people don't really ever get over that hatred of history class. And we have, over the past 15 years, really tried to bring some of these stories to life. Ann Mallinson, over the course of the 5 years of the Civil War sesquicentennial, besides the old drum play that we sometimes do, she wrote 3 plays, original scripts, about actual incidents of the Civil War that happened here in Johnson County. So it included a Masonic funeral of Benjamin Grover that we reenacted, and the tragic shooting of our county clerk, Marsh Foster, in the old courthouse. And then last fall, for the first time, we did a haunted tour of the old town of Warrensburg, down the alleys, and with characters positioned all along the way. And also part of that was a blue and gray wedding in the old courthouse, where a girl of a Confederate family married a boy who was from a Union family. So there was a little trouble. Not everyone was in favor, but that was kind of our end of the Civil War sesquicentennial play that, and has done a wonderful job writing and casting those pieces.
Now, one of the things you mentioned is something that folks might be familiar with if they've been around this area for a while, which is the trial as it relates to Old Drum, which we had the good fortune of shooting some video at the most recent one. Great way for you to really live the history as opposed to just read about it or hear about it, but to actually be there. So talk a little bit about that process and what people see when they come in during a performance of the play.
Well, we have a number of people who have been working with us for a long time, and we generally bring in some new young people each time we do the play. It's had many incarnations over the past. I've been working on the play for over 20 years. And I don't direct it anymore. We have a new director. Usually it's Ernie Burchard, a teacher at the high school. And the wonderful thing about experiencing this play in the old courthouse is that you're experiencing the history right where it happened. And we even often have a gentleman, John Burden, who's the descendant of Charles Burden, who owned the dog Old Drum. He plays the owner, so it's still a Burden in the role of that man who experienced a terrible loss of his best companion.
So that's something, obviously, that the story of the trial of Old Drum, maybe one of the things it's known best for is the notion of man's best friend, right? And that came out of that trial.
Right. One of the lines in the play, and that's where people get this notion, is that the one absolutely unselfish friend that a man can have in this selfish world, the one that will never prove ungrateful or treacherous, is his dog. And when Vest gave this speech, it was the closing arguments. Leonidas Hornsby, a brother-in-law of Charles Burden, had been accused of shooting the dog, and Charles Burden wanted restitution. So the court trial happened, and most people thought that this man, Mr. Hornsby, had every right to shoot a trespassing dog until the speech was given. And so George Graham Vest pulled out all the stops. He had biblical references. He had references to current songs and the sentiments of the time. And he just perfectly encapsulated the love between humans and dogs in that little speech so well that in 1999, William Safire called it the best speech of its type of the millennium, and it still makes people cry. So it's a powerful little piece of writing.
And interesting that just reverberates for, as you said, a century almost. You talk about that time period and the sentiments of that time period, but here still today we have the celebration of Old Drum, we have the reenactment of the trial, so it's one of those things that has sort of took on a life of its own.
Oh, and there is some really exciting news about the story. In April of last year, a young man, his name is actually Nathan Hale, and he is a New York Times best-selling author, and he writes graphic novels for young people. And after he visited, he created a YouTube video. It's 10 minutes long. You can find it under Nathan Hale Hazardous Tales, The Trial of Old Drum. And in a 10-minute video, he gives you the story of the trial, plus he is drawing while he does it. So you see his techniques in action. And then he has also photographs of our old courthouse on this YouTube video, now by a New York Times best-selling author. So I'm hoping that will cause a little more excitement about the story. But we do also, partly to support the Historical Society, besides plays, we also sell books. And I have two here today. One is our first book from the Johnson County Historical Society Press, and we did this about 4 years ago. And it's a wonderful biography of Hal Sappington. Used to teach math here at the university, and he has been playing a fiddle. One of my favorite stories is when he went off to the Navy. He had only so much room in his duffel bag, and so he took out his long underwear and replaced them with his fiddle. And so that's a great story about Hal. But this book is wonderful because it has a DVD, and if you want to learn how to play the violin or the guitar, it's 52 Missouri fiddle tunes up close, filmed by Rosemary Kinder, and Rosemary Kinder wrote this book, that are recorded by Herb Best and Hal Sappington on the fiddle. So it's almost a tutorial if you want to learn some of the regional music.
And so that book has been around for a while, so folks, if they haven't seen it before, you have that at the Historical Society, but you also have something that's pretty new, right?
Yes, this just came out this year. This is The Men Who Rode with Captain William C. Quantrill and Captain William T. Anderson, Their Lives, Their Loves, Their Stories. And of course, Quantrill is famous for taking a bunch of men from Missouri and going to burn Lawrence. But not a whole lot of people know that this story touches Johnson County personally, and that many of the guys that rode with Quantrill were from Johnson County, or at least they'd been run off from other counties and ended up here after Order Number 11. So the man who wrote this book, James A. White, is now one of our board members at the Johnson County Historical Society. He has been studying Quantrill and these men who were largely forgotten after the war. It's been kind of his passion project for many years. So he's talked to relatives of the people that rode with Quantrill, and he and a woman, Carolyn Bartles, who calls herself the Civil War Book Lady at civilwarbooklady.com, got together finally and published this book so that these stories wouldn't be lost. And that's one important thing about preserving history, is that once you get past a certain point, no one remembers or has any reason to write it down. So I had this page marked, but I no longer do. I might be able to find it. There's a little story of Clara Little. There were several women in Johnson County that got in big trouble during the Civil War, and they were arrested. And there was a terrible tragedy with women who were arrested and taken to a jail in Kansas City, and some people think that's what caused the burning of Lawrence, because the building fell down and the women died. But here in Johnson County, we had a little cache of women that were helping these men who were protecting their county. And the Missouri State Archives at sos.moga.gov, they have the Provost Marshal records from the Civil War, where it was almost like during the witch trials, where people would go to Jefferson City to the Provost Marshal and say, Clara Little is helping the bushwhackers. So I'll just tell you a little bit about Clara Little. Clara was a little bitty thing, only stood 4 feet 6 inches tall. She was a looker with light hair and blue eyes, but her good looks did not change her position on war. According to James Todd, who states that Clara Little has been a violent rebel since the start of the war. Clara came from a family of rebels. She was a sister to Thomas and Clara Little, and she had a sister, Fanny. Mr. Todd goes on to state that one day he was with Clara and Fanny in Warrensburg and asked Clara if there were any bushwhackers in their part of the country. Clara told him, "Come and see." So these were tough women, and they were, the aid and comfort they were giving was really mostly, say, a hat or a pair of boots or clothes, or food. They were feeding them. But anyway, that's why the Order number 11 cleared out the tier of counties west of us, and we were just fairly fortunate that that didn't happen, or the old courthouse wouldn't be still standing, because they burnt everything down one county over from us.
So when you think about this era, I know a lot of times, folks, you go through school or you watch, even something as brilliant as Ken Burns' documentary on the Civil War. But I know a lot of younger folks will watch those things, or they'll go through the process in school, and they don't get maybe the same flavor that you get when you actually read firsthand accounts or read the opinion of the folks from the day
Right.
of what's going on. That's a different flavor, right?
They aren't quite sanitized well. For one thing, the old saying about how history is written by the victors. These are forgotten stories of the people that didn't win at all. And these were people that were disenfranchised even during the war. They didn't belong to either army. And so it's not really that surprising that their stories are only in the letters they wrote to their families or in stories passed down. So the oral histories are great because it's not the same thing as a historian looking at it from a more objective position,
Right.
maybe.
Well, and also, it's easy for us today to forget about what life was like then. So, women weren't voting, and the changes that have occurred in the last century and a half. When you try to apply the way we think about things to someone from 1863,
Right.
their world was completely different.
Right. And that takes me a little bit back to Old Drum even. See, some people can't understand why there's a monument for Old Drum on the bank of Big Creek. And when we tell them that the body lay there, they can't believe that this dog didn't receive a proper burial. But that just wasn't the way people thought about things at that time. And, it's hard to judge even Quantrill for me. And these men, they were kind of backed into a corner. That's what creates guerrillas, is if they don't, they were like almost animals backed into a corner with nothing to do but just try to get out alive. And it's very similar to the guerrillas all over the world today that are being, pressured, and they react.
And it's, as I say, it's one of those things where you can't overlay today's morality or today's thinking. On the other hand, as you're just pointing out, we can understand what's happening today if we think about these stories like what has happened in the past.
Right. Yeah, technology has changed a lot, but human nature is fairly constant, I would say.
For good or for bad, right?
Right. So just to go on a little bit, if people want to know more about the Civil War, at the very beginning of April, it will be April 1st, 2nd, and 3rd, there is a special reenactment, Civil War reenactment going on here in Warrensburg out near the Veterans Home. And they call it a MAX effort. I think it's the Missouri Civil War Reenactors Association. And so they have called all their reenactors. See, I don't know how much you know about reenacting, but when you're in reenacting, you actually form a real brigade, like fantasy football, right? It's like fantasy football, only it's people today pretending to be people who were actually in battles. And so many of the battles that have been reenacted over the past year for the sesquicentennial are actual battles, but this one is more like a generic battle to show off the machinery of war and the
methods
and the uniforms and the one thing that really happens almost at every Civil War is reenactment is that the camping is one of the most important parts. So many of the reenactors bring period tents, and they cook with period ingredients in period coffee pots, and there's a word that they use to describe someone who's not reenacting accurately enough, and it's farb, and it means far be it from the real thing. But these people are very serious, and they try to get even down to the fabrics that are used. And so that will be a very interesting scenario going on out there.
And that's what are the dates again?
That's April 1st, 2nd, and 3rd. Carmen Gilbert Nelson is one of our volunteers who's been working on some of our costume collection. And we're going to have a booth out there so people can come visit us. And we are going to be specializing in petticoats that day. And we're going to have the prettiest petticoat contest. And we'll bring several of the finest ones. And that will be the opening weekend of it. And then it will continue the next week at the Old Drum Dog Festival on our grounds on April 9th.
Well, Lisa, we're out of time, but thank you for joining us. We'll have you back. We'll talk more about the upcoming event at the beginning of April. Thank you so much for joining us here on Pause, and thank you again, Lisa. We'll see you next time.